questions, comments? Back to our text. Page 40. Please refer to the last paragraph, fourth line. PRU is equivalent to GU. What was PRU? Primitive rule utilitarianism. It is equivalent to GU. What was GU? General utilitarianism. So they are equivalent and they are in the same boat. ARU, what was ARU? Actual rule utilitarianism. Seems questionable on the face of it, since it is very unlikely that the actually accepted moral rules of the society are all conducive to its greatest welfare or even necessary for its existence. This difficulty is compounded, moreover, by the fact that the prevailing rules vary considerably from society to society and change somewhat from time to time. So that it is hard to see how they might even be thought to maximize utility in the world as a whole. Yeah, for example, I was told that there is a rule called Sicilian rule of vengeance, often exemplified in gangster movie like Godfather, and that rule, eye to eye, nose to nose, mouth to mouth, and so on. Okay. Well, I'm afraid whether that really promotes to the greatest welfare. And again, I'm dubious whether that can be generalized, meeting the requirement of GU, for example. So the relativity of the validity of the rule in question somehow seems to affect our acceptance of ARU. As for the two forms of IRU, one was IRU, ideal rule utilitarianism. There are various problems about them, but I shall try to dispose of them by stating an objection that seems to me to hold against all forms of utilitarianism, since they all make maximizing the general balance of good over evil the sole ultimate criterion of right and wrong in morality, though some do it directly and others indirectly. This objection is a generalization of an argument by Sidgwick and many others. And we'll deal with this objection in this class today. And I'm afraid that objection may be a crucial objection applicable to all kinds of utilitarianism introduced and examined in this textbook called Ethics. So, if you are ready, shall we examine this crucial objection? Starting next paragraph. Whether the utilitarian talks in terms of particular actions, as in the case of act utilitarianism, general practices, as in the case of general utilitarianism, or rules and sets of rules in case of rule utilitarianism, no matter whether version you take in examining utilitarianism, we may imagine that two of them are such that we must choose between them, and such that if we knew the results of both of them, for example, namely both actions, practices, or rules, we would find that they are equal in utility. That is, they bring about the same balance of good over evil in the long run for the universe as a whole. Then the utilitarian must say that their moral score is the same, and there is no basis for choosing between them. And that is the general aspect of consequentialist ethics, including utilitarianism, in that consequentialist ethics, such as utilitarianism, only counts the consequence. Okay? Ignoring the process or means mobilized in resulting the consequence in question. So if the scores as consequences remain the same, then your action in question or the rule that was practiced in question, whatever, may be treated as the same from this utilitarian consequentialist point of view. And that, according to the author today, will cause insurmountable trouble. Let's follow the author. It may be still, however, that they distribute the balance of good over evil produced in rather different ways. One action, practice, or rule may, for example, give all the good to a relatively small group of people without merit on their part. And to let merit count at this point is already to give up pure utilitarianism, while the other may spread the good more equally over a larger amount of the population. In this case, it seems to me that we should and would say that the former is unjust and wrong, and the latter morally preferable. That is, if this is so, we must give up utilitarianism in all its forms. Now let me draw a chart which illuminates the point in question. Let us say that there are two actions or rules. Say action 1, rule 1, or action 2. They produce equal amount of utility. Then from utilitarian point of view, they are indiscernible. Right? They are both acceptable. But when we scrutinize the matter of distribution, we come to realize that in this case, in the first case, it has been unequally distributed. Okay? It results in unequal distribution. Is that unequal or unequal? Unequal? Are you sure? While the second version, the second action or rule resulted in equal distribution. Then we have the reason to prefer the first to the second, because we almost intuitively know that equal distribution is right, unequal wrong. Okay, but on what basis? On the basis of utilitarianism? But you know, utilitarianism allows for only one principle, as has been suggested by Bentham in the very first page of his masterpiece on utilitarianism, according to which the maximization of utility is a single point to be appreciated. There is no mention of the issue of distribution, and that, according to the author, causes an insurmountable trouble, because we do know almost intuitively that this equal amount of utility, once achieved by the practice of various versions of utilitarianism, whether they be act utilitarianism or rule utilitarianism, that's not enough. That has to be fairly distributed. But the issue of fair distribution has not even been mentioned in the classical texts of utilitarianism, because the classical utilitarians stick to the single principle of utility and is interested in the maximization of the utility alone. So the concern for distribution is entirely lacking if classical utilitarians stick to the single principle of utility. All right? And that is what is at stake. And if you compare this classical version of utilitarianism and ancient Korean philosophy found in Dangun mythology, which was distribution of the good to mankind, you can easily find the flaw in these modern versions of utilitarianism, because even ancient mythological thought that we have studied in reading Dangun mythology also emphasizes the issue of distribution, right? So you have to care for equal distribution, but to practice that, we have to go beyond utilitarianism, which is solely based upon the principle of utility. Okay? So we have to enrich utilitarianism by adding the concern for fair distribution, but I'm not sure whether that enriched version of utilitarianism with concern for fair distribution may be still called utilitarianism, because utilitarianism, this enriched version of utilitarianism already violated the so-called the single principle of utility. by introducing some external principle of distribution. Perhaps you may reply, what the heck? Why not simply adding the concern for distribution and still claiming that updated, enriched version of utilitarianism? Well, you can do it, but here, from the viewpoint of moral science, as has been emphasized by Bentham, I'd like to pay rather more attention to the internal consistency, because in science, consistency matters. And so we have in this enriched version of utilitarianism with external principle of fair distribution, we seem to have two seemingly not consistent principles in the same boat called utilitarianism. The first principle was utility. The principle of utility were embraced by Bentham, and today, suddenly, as the result of the criticism from without, we had to introduce another external principle called the principle of fair distribution of the goods. Okay, and that is the reason why the situation today is troublesome to utilitarians. Okay, let's get back to our text and sharpen our insight that we just learned today. Third paragraph of page 41, the point is that an action, practice, or a rule may maximize the sum of the good in the world and yet be unjust in the way in which it distributes its sum, so that a less beneficent one that is more just may be preferable. Okay? And in our case, the first version of utilitarianism may be a good example. From utilitarian point of view, this first version is highly recommended. Why? Because it contributes to the maximum amount of utility. Okay. In that sense, indiscernible from the second version. But anyway, both versions are equally recommended because both fulfill the requirement of the principle of utility, because both guarantee the maximum amount of utility. But it is unjust version because it failed to fulfill another requirement from without. What do you mean by another requirement from without? The requirement of equal distribution. Right? It violated that second requirement, and we can call that first version unjust, despite the fact that from utilitarian point of view, there's nothing wrong with this first version. So we have in deep trouble. Right? For instance, it might be for the greatest general good to follow the rule of primogeniture, and yet it might be unjust to do so. Yeah, some act which promotes the maximum utility may have to be prohibited because it may be unjust for some other reason. And the author's favorite example was primogeniture. I'm not sure whether primogeniture really contributes to the maximization of utility, but I do know that it can be unjust, no matter whether it contributes to the maximization of utility or not. It may be just unjust. Go on. If this is so, then the criterion for determining right and wrong is not mere utility, but also justice. Again, that leads us to the deep trouble in handling utilitarianism, since we saw in the earlier pages of Bentham and even Mill that in the language of utilitarianism, maximization of utility is automatically interchangeable with rightness. All right? But according to the criticism today, that won't do, because another factor of justice has to be considered in judging the given act or rule to be right and wrong. So we may need dual criteria rather than a single criteria. What do you mean by dual criteria? In addition to the previous criterion of the maximization of utility, we have to consider the second factor of fair distribution, namely justice. Okay? Skipping. Let us read the second last paragraph of the same page. Utilitarians may make 3 replies to this argument. Okay? Utilitarians now strike back with 3 replies to this argument. Which argument? Argument showing that utilitarianism is totally blind to the just requirement of fair distribution. Right? One reply is offered by John Stuart Mill near the end of utilitarianism. If you consult that work, Utilitarianism, authored by Mill, at the end of that small monograph, you will find a chapter entitled Utilitarianism and Justice, where John Stuart Mill attempts to contain or incorporate the requirement of fair distribution in his version of utilitarianism. And the author is now introducing that part of Mill's utilitarianism. He contends that whatever satisfies the principle of utility also satisfies the requirements of justice, since justice is built into the principle of utility. Let us hear what Mill claims in that word. Social and distributive justice, Mill continues, is involved in the very meaning of utility or the greatest happiness principle. That principle is mere form of words, unless one person's happiness, supposed equal in degree, is counted for exactly as much as another's. These conditions being supplied, Bentham's dictum, everybody to count for one, nobody for more than one, might be written under the principle of utility as an explanatory commentary. So the point of Mill's reply is that another principle of justice is actually unnecessary. We don't have to introduce that another principle, because that principle of justice is already embedded in the so-called single principle of utility. I repeat, according to Mill, there is no incompatibility between the so-called two principles, principle of utility and that of justice, because the former, the principle of utility, already contains the latter, the principle of justice, in its connotation. But the critical commentary follows just after the quotation. Here, Mill is confused. It is true that the principle of utility requires us, when we are determining what to do, to count the effects of each action, practice, or rule on everyone, and to weigh equal effects equally in the computation of the scores for each action or rule, no matter who is concerned. Yeah, that is guaranteed because, as I told you, utilitarianism is actually consequentialism. But in our example, we have done all that by hypothesis, and the score still comes out even. It remains true that the two alternatives distribute the same amount of good in different ways. Two versions distribute the same amount of utility in different ways. According to the first version, in unequal way, and in the second version, in equal way. All right? The principle of utility cannot tell us which distribution to choose. Only a separate principle of justice can tell us this. So the introduction of another principle of utility, which guarantees fair distribution, is urgently required, despite Mill's claim otherwise. Mill might answer in the next paragraph that we should understand the principle of utility as enjoining us to promote the greatest good of the greatest number. And our author italicized the greatest number. Okay? So the promotion of the greatest good of the greatest number, which is in fact how it is often formulated. Yeah, we were often told that the principle of utilitarianism is the promotion of the greatest good of the greatest number. Number counts. Even in the first version of Bentham's utilitarianism, if we understand thus, the principle does tell us that we are to distribute a given quantity of good to more people rather than to fewer, when we have a choice. The principle of utility thus becomes a double principle. It tells us to produce the greatest possible balance of good over evil, and secondly, to distribute this as widely as possible. That is, it has become a combination of the principle of utility with the principle of justice. And to read it thus is to give up pure utilitarianism for the view we are about to describe. But I'm afraid the author of this text, Frank Kenna, is missing the most crucial point of his own criticism. One, actually in the criticism of utilitarianism, number is not that much important. Even though Bentham or even Mill may say that the principle of utility is the promotion of the greatest good of the greatest number, fair distribution doesn't follow out of our concern for the distribution of the greatest good to the greatest number, because fair distribution is one thing, distribution of the good to the greatest number, that's another. We can distribute the good in question to the greatest number, but unequally. Can you imagine that? Why not? So unequal distribution cannot be checked even when we distribute the given good acquired by utilitarian request to the greatest number. So here author's criticism of utilitarianism is right in that utilitarianism has to accept another external principle of justice or distribution, adding the distribution of the good to the greatest number, but I'm afraid that that is still not sufficient because fair distribution has to be considered as well as the distribution of the good to the greatest number. Okay? Good. And the second reply has been proposed by these people. If we give up hedonism, they point out, we can hold that there are a number of different kinds of things that are good. Pleasure, knowledge, love, aesthetic experience, and the like. We can even hold that one of the good things to be promoted is an equal or just distribution of the other things. Then, when we are calculating our scores, we must figure in not only the value of pleasure and other such goods that are produced, but also the value of the pattern of distribution involved. This sounds like a plausible view, and it does, if accepted, take care of my general objection to utilitarianism. I find it unconvincing, however, for the following reason. Skipping one line, it seems clear to me that pleasure, knowledge, and many other experiences and activities are good in themselves. But I do not see that a pattern of distribution is also non-morally good thing in itself. I think it may be morally right in itself to bring about such a pattern. However, and so I conclude that those who take the view just described are confusing rightness with goodness. Now, this is tricky. According to the author, establishing establishing maximum account of utility, that is good. Okay? But the problem of justice, guaranteeing equal distribution, that belongs to rightness. They belong to different categories, according to the author. Violating the previous equation found in the language of utilitarians. We saw in the reading of Bentham and Mill that in the language of utilitarianism, what is good is also right. Okay? What gives us interest, what gives us pleasure, what gives us utility in general, they are all good and also right. But here, in introducing the criticism from without, emphasizing the significance of the issue of fair distribution as justice, the author introduces the sharpened distinction between right and good. Right? What do you mean by the distinction between right and good? The problem of utility containing pleasure, interest, whatever, they belong to the issue of goodness. When utility has been maximized, that is good, but not always right. Because what is right and wrong always have to accompany the issue of justice. And what do you mean by the issue of justice? Justice as fairness. Again, what do you mean by justice as fairness? Justice as fair distribution of the good. And only when that issue has been correctly considered can we call the given act or rule to be right or wrong. So according to the critical point of view, which somehow re-examines the validity of utilitarianism, we have to somehow modify the previous grammar of utilitarianism. Namely, from now on, we have to be able to distinguish right and good. Utility belonging to the vocables of good, right, distribution and fair distribution as justice belong to the vocables of right. So only when fairness has been achieved can we say that the given issue, given act or rule be called right, if not wrong. All right? In this manner, we somehow develop or sharpen the previous classical language of utilitarianism, where there is no distinction between right and good. Okay, that is the second point from the author's criticism of utilitarianism. Now back to our text. Indeed, I'm reading the fifth last line of the second last paragraph of the same page 42. I suspect that they find that view plausible only because it seems to provide a way of meeting the difficulty in question. If this is so, then their reply fails. In fact, it lends support to my contention that certain patterns of distributing things are right in themselves, and not merely because what they are conducive to. You know what's going on here? Well, Mill, in his the last chapter of utilitarianism, may say that equal distribution is right because it promotes a maximum amount of utility. So Mill's reply is that I knew the significance of justice as equal distribution because I believe that equal distribution promotes the maximum amount of utility. But the author intervenes. Equal distribution is right, no matter whether it promotes the maximum amount of utility or not. The promotion of the maximum amount of utility is separate problem, not easily intermingled with equal distribution as fairness, as justice. So the problem of justice has to be separable from the problem of maximum utility. In this manner, we have to be able to separate the issue of rightness from the issue of goodness. Okay? So, you come to realize that we made another step. We began our discussion with distribution of a boon to mankind that we gleaned from our reading of Tanmud mythology. And we accepted it because it seems intuitively valid. But that's not enough. Starting Bandam, we came to realize that modality to which Bandam belongs requires morality or ethics to be scientific. So when Bandam envisioned his utilitarian ethics to be moral scientific. And to achieve that criterion of scientificity, we have to consider inner consistency of the given theory. We have to balance the principles in due order and so on. And in doing this, we here today encounter insurmountable problem with the original version of utilitarianism, in the sense that utilitarianism is almost impotent to the issue of justice. And utilitarianism is not elaborate in that it just confused the issue of goodness with that of rightness. So from now on, with this background information, we have to be rather more careful in handling the issue of the distribution of a boon to mankind. All right? These first two replies I'm reading could be made by utilitarians of other sorts, but the third only by a rule utilitarian. He, like Brent, a major champion of rule utilitarianism, he might contend that a certain principle for distributing the good, for example, that we should distribute it as widely and equally as possible, is itself one of the rules of the general acceptance of which would maximize utility. In other words, he might maintain that the necessary principle of distributive justice can itself be established by a rule utilitarian line of reasoning. Such a reply can be satisfactory, if at all, only if it is a fact that the rule of distribution specified is more conducive to the greatest general balance of good over evil than alternative rules. This, however, cannot be shown to be a fact. If it is not a fact, my general objection to utilitarianism holds. But suppose it were the case that the rule of distributing equally, say, would maximize utility, then rule utilitarianism would be saved only by a lucky fact about the world, provided, of course, that it is free from other factual objections. This bothers me. For then, the rule utilitarians must say that if the rule of distributing equally were not utility maximizing, then it would not be valid. But this is just the issue, and to me it seems clear that the equal distribution rule would be valid anyway. Yeah. The final response from utilitarianism was like this. Equal distribution is right because it promotes the maximization of the utility. Well, I have two objections based upon the text. First is it really the case? Is it true to the fact? That has to be examined. The second point of my objection is, what if equal distribution does not promote the maximization of utility? In that case, is that not right? I think not. I think it is right, no matter whether it promotes the maximization of utility or not. This pattern of equal distribution is always right, no matter whether it promotes the maximal utility or not. And that clearly indicates that the issue of justice is another separable issue. And to treat it fairly, you have to study the theory of justice transcending these classical versions of utilitarianism. Okay? So it is high time for us to introduce the next reading material, the title of which is A Theory of Justice. When you check the notice for our class webpage, you can find how to download the next reading